Welcome to our latest Book Reporter Talks to interview. I'm so happy that our guest today is Bruce Holsinger, who is the author of The Gifted School. Now, I read The Gifted School last year and love this in hardcover, and I picked it as a Book Reporter Bets On selection. It is a brisk read, it's a fun read, and it's also whip smart, and I love books that are like this. So welcome, Bruce. I'm so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here.
So let's start by you telling us a little bit about the plot, the storyline of The Gifted School.
Sure. Yeah. So The Gifted School follows a group of 4 or 5 families that are living in an affluent town called Crystal, Colorado, which is based on Boulder, Colorado, where I lived and taught for a number of years. And they're families that have known each other for a long time, and they become obsessed when it's announced that a new magnet school for exceptionally gifted children is going to open in their Colorado town. And the admissions rate is going to be about 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, and everybody just wants to get their kid into this school. So it's a book about competitive parenting. It's about what we now call snowplow parenting in the wake of the college admissions scandal. And it's about what can happen when people want the best for their kids, but how often that can go awry and maybe not come out the way that we want it to. But it's also a novel about families. It's a novel about friendship and marriage and parenting. And I tell the story from, I think it's 6 different points of view. Everyone from, a couple of the kids who are rising 6th graders, so they're in 5th grade, they're 11 years old at the time, to a couple of the parents' points of view, a teenager who's struggling, we see her point of view in a video blog, to a grandmother of a kid who's living out in a different part of the system, and has some real ambivalence about her grandchild. So it's an intergenerational saga about an admissions crisis or an admissions scandal in Colorado on the Front Range of the Rockies. So that's the novel in a nutshell.
Yeah, and you definitely, you've got so many fabulous pieces in the novel. It's kind of funny that we're talking about gifted school when right now everybody wishes their kids were in school. They wish they know if their kids were going back to school, because we've got virtual school, and we have who's going to be online learning. We've had just so much. Think about if this book had come out like a year later, because everyone was just home. And imagine now you're not only going to homeschool, but you're going to homeschool gifted and talented. I think there are a lot of parents would say, put him back in the regular group. Like, I don't need him to be in the gifted and talented.
Exactly. And so one of the points of research I did for the book was, how, the different structures of gifted education in public schools, in private schools, specifically designed with gifted kids in mind, and everything in between. And, I learned a lot about not just about the bureaucratic structures that deal with gifted and talented kids, so-called in a lot of cases, but also parental expectations and the expectations on the part of teachers. That was a fascinating strand to follow through.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden everybody sees exactly what it means all day to have your child sit still, learn virtually, sit there and follow a lesson, and how much can they apply themselves, and how much are they being motivated all day long by whoever the teacher is. I just find that really interesting right now.
Exactly.
I read somewhere that you said that this is a novel about privilege, economic inequality, racial disparity, but also about ambition, friendship, and family, about the intertwined challenges of parenting and growing up in a pressure cooker environment that overvalues superficial signs and status and rank. And I think that is so dead on of what's going on right now. We're not looking at children as people. We're looking them as conduits to college, to where they're going to be someday. And they don't even get a chance to develop, I feel like. And that's what you're seeing in the book, is everybody has where they're going to be, not where they are and how they're going to get there.
Yeah, and so much of what that comes down to is, it's a sign. Often it's a sign of prestige where your kid goes to school. This is very true in the college admissions racket, where the first thing, if my kid is going to Princeton, the first word out of my mouth if I bump into you in the grocery store is, "Well, Joey just loves Princeton," or there's all those kinds of brags. And what's interesting is in this quarantine crisis right now. You'd like to think that that's diminished and that people are thinking about different things and maybe reshuffling priorities. But it's very interesting to me that one of the first things that you saw, when all the colleges were closing down, the budget crises were hitting, and it's just going to get worse this next summer. So much of the discussion initially was about, oh my God, it's actually going to be easier to get your kid into one of these schools next year. But then also kids, if your kid is a high school junior this year, oh boy, you're in luck. There was a kind of sick, twisted way that got covered. And now who knows what kids are going to do. I mean, the parents right now are struggling so much about, where to think about their kids' futures at all, let alone where they go to college. So it's one, you said that, what if the novel had come out this year? Like, the novel was published almost exactly a year ago. If it were published now, I just think, what, I can imagine reading it and just think, who would even care about any of these things, but then maybe a year from now, we'll all be back in the same racket.
Same racket, same mode. It is interesting because people, a lot of times, if they don't say, Tommy's going to college, we're going to Princeton, we're going to Harvard. And I'm like, what's the we're in this whole thing?
Yeah.
Sitting at my older son is now 30, but I remember sitting in that back to school night, like that senior or junior night where they start talking about this. And I walked out and I was like, oh my gosh, my head is so on overload of all the things we're supposed to do. And in the big scheme of things, what do you want to do is you actually want to make a kid who's fabulous on their own. Like, it's not just being bright, it's just being a great person. But we cut that out of the equation. It's about the grades, it's about the marks, it's about all these kinds of things. Whereas recently you've been seeing which kids adapted well, what people need at this point. And your point about college, I have a lot of friends that saying, my kids are taking a gap year this year because there's no way I'm spending money to send them to learn in the dining room again. So it was really funny.
Well, and it's important to point out, I think the school in this novel, in The Gifted School, it's a public magnet school. So it doesn't, on the surface, it doesn't have anything to do with whether you can afford it or not. It's just whether your kid gets in or not. And I structure the novel around, a couple of different cuts. The first cut is an IQ test, supposedly objective, but of course it has all kinds of ways that it disadvantages people who come from a different socioeconomic bracket, can't afford the test prep, maybe haven't had didn't have breakfast that morning when they took the test. So there's that. And then all those kids also have to put together a portfolio in order to demonstrate an exceptional kind of talent. It's also not about college admissions. It's about admissions to a school that goes grades 6 through 12. Right. But of course I wrote it way before Operation Varsity Blues. But it was in that climate that it came out. And so whenever I talk about it, that's just inevitably a subject that comes up.
Yeah, it's like, wait a second, were you clairvoyant about what was going to happen, every single step of the way? It's set in Crystal, Colorado. What made you choose that as the setting? Like, why at that place? Yeah. I love Colorado. I mean, if I was living not on the East Coast, it's where I'd want to live. But I was just interested why.
Well, I think it's where the idea for the novel first came to me, even though I haven't lived there for over 15 years. But I spent the first part of my career, my day job, I'm an academic. I teach English at the University of Virginia. And my first academic job was at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I don't know if you've been to Boulder, how many of your listeners or viewers have, but it's just a perfect cream puff of a town. It's just absolutely beautiful, nestled up against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, about a half an hour north of Denver. But it's also called the Berkeley of the Rockies because it's a very, very progressive town. Even more than Berkeley, though, it's very homogeneous demographically and economically. It's a very wealthy town, very affluent, very, very white. I think when I was researching the novel, I think I saw something like 95% white Boulder, Colorado is. And that really, that was an element of the town that I wanted to explore. I wanted to think about inequity through that lens of privilege, through the lens of racial difference, class difference, and also about progressive politics, because of course the main characters in the novel or the families. There are these 4 women who have known each other for 10 or 11 years since their kids were born, since their kids were babies. They actually met in a baby swim class, and of course they're all progressive. They're all well-meaning. They're not all white, but they are all very, very comfortable to different degrees. And so that was something I wanted to poke a little bit. The novel definitely pokes at progressive politics in a way that we often don't maybe poke at ourselves enough, especially when it comes to parenting. And one of the little flashpoints of the novel, I think, is, those exceptions that we will make to our hardcore political purities when it comes to securing the best for our kids.
Right, right.
And that's the thing that's made a lot of readers uncomfortable with it that I've talked to over the last year, is that sense of, wait a minute, are you criticizing me? I just want what's best for my kid. And that can, that's a perfect material for a novel.
Yeah, there's this little fine line of what do you want, but it's just me and my exception on just this one thing. It's not on everything. It's just this one thing. It's my child, and that's okay.
Right, exactly.
Now, I remember you nurtured this idea for a long while. It was something you started a while back. Did you keep stopping and starting it, or was it something that was sitting in a drawer for a while?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's not a long story, but I guess I went back to an old computer actually, and found that the first drafts of a chapter I wrote were probably back in 2009, I want to say, or 8. So, it's been 11 or 12 years, and when our kids were much younger. And I worked on it. I probably wrote 6 or 7 chapters, and then I moved on to something else. And it wasn't the first novel I published, it's my 3rd novel. And after writing a couple of historical novels, my first 2, and then The Gifted, and I was kind of stumbling around thinking, what am I going to do next? I drafted a couple of parts of different novels, was wondering what to do. And I was really just talking to my agent, and she, was always interested in what I have in the drawer. And I said, yeah, I'd been working for a while on this novel about called The Gifted School. And she said, stop. She's she's British. She said, stop, say that again. And so I said it again, and she said, that's the novel you need to write. And I did. And so I took the next, 6 months or so to write up the proposal, and that's what sold. And then I finished the novel over the next year. It wrote itself really quickly once I decided to go back to it.
That's what I was going to say, is how long did it take once you got back to the idea? Because it's such a brisk read. I felt like it was a brisk write, because I felt like you had your ideas there, like the character ideas. And I felt like the story, there's sometimes when you're reading a novel, the story feels halting. Like you feel like, oh, there's where the edit came. There's where this came. And I didn't feel it on this book. I felt like it was a very cohesive story. And I didn't see like, oh, we inserted such and such a character later. Because sometimes you can feel that as a reader. Sometimes it just trips you up. And I didn't feel that at all. So tell me I'm wrong.
You're definitely wrong. And that's interesting, because I think I have, the good thing about it is it's got a very clear plot line. Like, exactly what's going to happen. It's an admissions process, right? It's a bunch of competitive parents trying to get their kids into this school. And so the story arc from the beginning. What you don't know are all the character arcs and how those are going to intersect. And in fact, the initial, not draft, but I think the proposal only had 2 viewpoint characters. Just Rose, the main character. She's a pediatric neurologist. She's a brilliant scientist and clinician. Thinks about kids' brains all day in her work. Then she comes home and she thinks about her daughter's brain and how smart she is and whether she's gifted, right? And then the other character originally in the novel was Xander, this 11-year-old. He's a chess genius, and he's the son of a friend of Rose's. So I was originally just going to do it in their points of view. And it was really just in discussions with my editor that we decided to, branch things out. And the last character I wrote actually was Emma Zeller, who ended up being, I think she has the fewest words of any of the characters, but she ended up being my favorite character because she is in some ways a moral lens on everyone else. And she's one of the kids getting most messed up by her parents and their pursuit of prestige. So, so the novel, I'm glad to hear you say that it's a seamless story, but, in the conception of it, that was years and years. The writing itself was pretty brisk, but I think it's because it was all up here when it started coming out.
Right. And it opens with Emma. It opens with Emma Z, doesn't it? And it opens where she's taking a test. So you realize something is really being set up in a big way here, because you feel the pressure she's going through.
Yeah. So, in fact, it sits with her. The prologue of the novel is, actually takes place later in the novel, and it's when she's taking this IQ test. And everybody's watching, and she's very aware of the pressure, and 2 minutes left on the clock, and she's sitting there with a bubble sheet and a pencil and filling it out, and nervous about the clock. And so I was trying to build suspense in the very beginning.
And it does, because you remember being that person with the bubbles, with the test,
Yeah, exactly,
and you're watching the clock, and you feel like if you cough, you're going to blow it. Like you're going to cough, you're going to blow what, wherever you're going to be going to school. So which was there a character that came very easily? I mean, you enjoyed writing her. Is there somebody else, like Rosa was there, and she's such a fully formed character. They're all fully formed as well. Was there somebody that right at the beginning you immediately related to besides her, besides Emma Z?
Oh yeah. So another character who came in much earlier was Beck.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
Beck is, how do I describe him? He's like like a Bernie Bros soccer dad. That's who Beck is. He's really, in some ways, he's got a kind of holier than thou aspect to him. He drives an Audi with a Feel the Burn bumper sticker peeling off because, of course, it's years later. But he's also obsessed with his kids and their talents on the soccer field.
Mm-hmm.
So he's an overinvested soccer dad who will pace the sidelines with a vein throbbing in his skull. And so he's an appalling person, and I think I hope readers will root for him, even though he's so appalling. But he was so fun to write because I was, poking fun at myself a little bit too. I'm kind of an obsessed soccer dad. I'm a recovering soccer dad. I'm sure I have my own progressive hypocrisies that I'm blind to. And I think that you don't often see that character enough as an object of satire. We get these, very self-serious kind of auto-fiction writing progressive men. And that, to me, what's the fun in that? So I wanted to poke a little around the edges and have a different kind of character. He's not the main protagonist, but he's, one of the main point of view characters who floats in and out.
And when he does, we realize how the sports obsession is so similar to what's going on with school.
Exactly. Yeah.
Everyone is going to be a star. Everyone is going to be I remember my sister lived in Georgia, and they came in and they said they were going to take some children to Italy because they were looking for stars for the Italian soccer team. And I'm sitting there like, yes, but they're also realizing that this is a wealthy area. And if you tell the parents this, they're going to pay and go. So you realize there was a little bit of a game going on here of what was happening. And it's the same thing. It's a prestigious school. It's a prestigious league. You don't want your son just to be in baseball. You want to be in travel baseball, like whatever the things are. It's not, there's always something that's the pinnacle. It's like, we're also going to be spending every season, soccer season, in Florida at the Disney, big tournament or something like that. And you realize that you spent like 8 years of your life. That's what you're doing with your kids. And then you sit there and go, what did we just do? Why?
Yeah, that's right. When we first see Beck in the novel, he's taking his kids down to Colorado Springs, a couple hours away, for a travel soccer game. And, just thinking about all the Panera that he's eaten and so on, and just taking these kids to these things. So, and he is the father of twins. Right. And the twins have been, one twin, Charlie, has, for years been the superior athlete, the real star of the team. And suddenly Aiden is starting to catch up. Mm-hmm. And it could also be true that Aiden is more gifted and that he did better on this test. And so that, it's tearing a family from within. Between these two siblings. So that's another dynamic. And you're right that it's that competition over the soccer prowess is really parallel to the problem of giftedness that's plaguing all the parents in the book.
Yeah, my younger son played baseball, and I used to go to the games, and it was really fun. Well, they always wanted my children to be on the team, or my son to be on the team, and there was a reason. My husband would always assistant coach because he worked from home and he had time, and I would always discuss books and bring galleys to the stands. So Corey says, this has nothing to do with my talent, has everything to do with my parents is the reason I'm on this team, right? So I was there, remember once, and one of the mothers said, and I think they might have been like 5th or 6th grade. She goes, at one point, are they going to stop being VG plus? Because they're not all going to Harvard. Right. She goes, at what point is the cutoff going to happen that we all don't get the smiley face on our papers? Like, when is this tragedy going to start happening that they're going to feel like failure and they're going to start seeing failure in a different way? And I have always remembered that line, because when kids are little, it's always a smiley face on the paper and the encouragement. And then it starts to be who's who, who's where, who ranks where, or whatever. So
Yeah.
that's what I found so interesting in the book was you're seeing it from the parents' perspective, but also these children who feel themselves being viewed differently
Yeah.
now. Like I'm not viewed the
Yeah.
same way.
And you know, in terms of that, gifted education has a pretty dark history for the last 50 years in terms of that kind of stratification. And you know that in my town, Charlottesville, according to research by a colleague who teaches in the School of Education here, there, you know, the gifted school Quest in the public schools was initially set up, if I'm remembering correctly, specifically as a kind of unspoken form of segregation when the schools were being integrated. And that, you know, that I've met a lot of teachers and administrators who do gifted education for their careers who are incredibly committed and really invested in leveling the playing field. And I completely admire them. But it's undeniable that in a lot of places, this has been one among many forms of stratification. The places who do it well, do it really well. And I was trying to model Crystal Academy, the name of the gifted school in my novel, on on some of the places that have done it really, really well, thinking about equity and diversity and so on. And that's part of the point, is that even a school like that, maybe especially a school like that, is the shining star, and the parents are going to be especially invested in getting their kids into an environment like that.
Yeah, it's
They
like
might go against the principles. Yeah.
Yeah, where you want to go, but to get them there, are you going to be yourself, or who
Yeah.
are you going to turn in to be there? You said you did a lot of research. Who did you speak with along the way? Because I felt like there's a foundation behind the book. There's a foundation of what happened with gifted and talented children and what psychiatrists have seen and what psychologists. Did you do a lot of research on the back end like that?
Yeah. So, and I talked to some people in the National Association for Gifted Children. I talked to the heads of school and admissions directors at a number of gifted schools. I talked to, you know, the coordinators of gifted and talented programs at public schools. And, you know, I was interested in a lot of different things. One was just the basics of the process. Like if you were going to have a magnet school like this, like a Thomas Jefferson School in Northern Virginia, you know, there's a zillion of them. If you're going to have a magnet school specifically for gifted kids, what would that admissions process look like? What would your pool look like? What are the steps? What's the stuff you'd want to see? And so I cobbled together my own version of the logistics, and it took me, you know, months, but of course I distilled it into a few paragraphs in the novel, and that, but just to make it realistic. And then I also talked to people about the personalities of truly gifted kids, you know, and what those characteristics might be. And I talked to people who deal with race and diversity in terms of gifted education, and what are some of the ways of you know, making the admissions process more rigorous, more socioeconomically rigorous, so you can be doing an honest assessment of people, not just an honest assessment of a particular percentage of people who happen to be wealthy and white. I think that's actually a line from the novel. And so I have the other thing I did, though, is I didn't want that all just to be research that I gave in the book. I wanted those to be topics of discussion in the book. And so there's a few places where you see a Facebook group where parents are actually arguing about those things, arguing about race and affirmative action and diversity, also arguing about whether giftedness is really a thing, whether giftedness is the same as a disability that requires accommodations in the schools. There's a huge, fierce argument about that, and there long has been. So I wanted to make those arguments internal to the theme of the book and part of the plot. And so, you know, I just found various ways of doing that stylistically within the chapters.
And I think that's the reason it works so well, is you were bringing it from different people's points of view. And then you were actually saying, take this seat back. I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't considered that, but you never felt like you were being lectured. You felt like you were seeing it through their lens. You were seeing it through their eyes. And I appreciated that. You know, gifted and talented, you know, so many people want to think about this. You've got this epigraph at the start of the book that reads, "There's something so tantalizing about having a gifted child that some parents will go to almost any lengths to prove that they have one." I just love that. Did you have that line for a long time, or did that come up later?
The story of that line is actually one of my favorite things to talk about with the gifted school. That sentence was actually written by my mother, because the epigraph comes from a book called The Little Boy Book. that
Okay.
she co-authored with a woman named Rune Frost. Her pen name was Sheila Moore. She actually just died last January after a long illness. My mom did. And this was a book on child development, published back in the 1980s. I think it was in print for 20 or 30 years. And it's a book about child development and the psychology of boys. And my mom was a Montessori teacher, as well as a writer. And she was a big believer in level playing fields. I actually learned to read and write in the basement of our house, where she had a Montessori school in Fairfax, Virginia. And so her existence as an educator and a writer was always in the background, as I've been writing over my life. And when I was researching this book, when I was in the later stages of writing the book, when I was kind of sewing it up, she was already kind of in middle stages of dementia. I told her what I was working on, and she just kind of nodded, and she said, "The Little Boy Book." And and she couldn't say I talk about that in there. But I went back and got my copy, and I found this sentence, and I realized I had read this sentence before, and I think that had been my kind of earworm for years and years. And that's what the book is about. There is something so tantalizing about having a gifted child that some parents will go to almost any lengths to prove they have one. That is the book, the novel.
Yeah.
So and for her, it was just a kind of a toss off line in a paragraph in her book about gifted kids. But I realized that's the epigraph right there.
What a gift. What a
Yeah,
gift. I mean, that was just so perfect. So perfect.
Yeah.
And I, of course, didn't connect it when I looked at it because it wasn't the same name.
Oh, yeah,
So,
exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
oh, that's wonderful. That's really, really wonderful. In your book, we've got the faked IQ test results. I love the faking of this. The attempted
That's
bribes.
a spoiler, though. So.
Oh, did I not say that? Okay, right.
Oh, no,
Okay.
that's okay, actually. Keep it in. That doesn't matter. Because nobody knows who faked it, right?
Nobody knows who faked it. We've got bribes. We've got puffed up achievements, which I think every parent does.
Yeah.
And stolen credit. I mean, we've just got taught. We're not going to even get into who does what to whom. And then the sad thing is it all happens. I mean, that all happens. What you've got here in the book are things that people are actually doing. You just have them all conglomerated into these 4 different families, which I also find fun because they've known each other since this swim class when the kids were little. And sometimes in the early days of swim class, their personalities are all formed of who's going to be the alpha mom, who's going to be this, and who is going to be whom as time goes on.
Yeah.
And you're seeing a lot of these same traits now of who's pushing their kid further in the water. They should be in this different group. They should knew who the parents were. And now they're shining in a whole different way on what they're doing. So it's a very competitive group.
And these moms, are all kind of looking back in a way too, and they're thinking about the mistakes they made. And so is Beck. One of the little, this is a confession, but one of the autobiographical moments in the book is when this character Azra, who is Beck's ex-wife, the mother of their twins, they're exes. They were divorced years before, but they get along. Yeah, they have a very amicable relationship. And she thinks fondly back on this story that he told her, where he was down in a playground on the downtown mall with one of the kids, and there was this little girl who looked about the age of his son, who was walking around and babbling happily, and then when his son, I think it was Aiden, started to walk, couldn't walk as well and couldn't really speak as well. And she asked how old the kid was, and Beck lied and said that the kid was 6 months younger than he actually was. And just as a way, because the mom was being so smug about how perfect her daughter was and how well developed she was. And this is something I will confess to have done 20 years ago, in my defense, when our older son was toddling around. And and I think there's always just a little chip on your shoulder. What are other kids doing? Yes. How are they developing? How have they hit the milestones? And I think that, I wanted to be honest about that, and, be straightforward about these kinds of resentments that we all have.
Well, you always remember when you first took your child to nursery school, and everybody remembers dropping them off for the first time. I remember my son walked away and didn't look back. I went back to my husband and I said, he never looked. And he turned around and goes, that's a good thing. You did a good job. And
That's
then
what you
one
want.
mother who sat outside the room with a like a pet's like stuffed snake around her neck for 6 months. And this child would come out every couple of minutes and look. So, okay, years later happen, and you run into mother who sat with snake around neck, and you see that child and you realize the child is perfectly fine. Like everything's okay. But at the
exactly.
time, it was this huge stigma that I can't even remember the child's name, but it was this poor child couldn't go to class without mom sitting there outside. And you realize they all outgrow whatever the things are. Like it all, there are things we have to worry about a lot more. But at the time, you felt so much better because your child just went in the room.
Exactly.
Was that really okay? So, but once again, besides the hitting on Varsity Blues, which came out, was it just before this book or right after? I'm trying to remember.
It was after. And this book, the ARC, the Advanced Reader's Copy, was circulating in March. It had been circulating for a few months. It had gotten a few advanced reviews. And my father-in-law emailed me and said, Bruce, when the New York Times story hit about Felicity Huffman and so on, he emailed it to me and said, this is your novel. And I started reading and I thought, oh my God. And of course, my publicist was thrilled, and everything and that was really the lens through which the novel was received. I think it was the Wall Street Journal called it the novel that predicted the college admissions scandal. Right. I mean, it did no such thing. It wasn't about college admissions, but it's been kind of hilarious that the book was received that way.
Yeah, and it's funny because I went back and I'd seen some interviews that were done with you and we were all talking to you about Felicity Huffman. And also I was like, wait a second, I think I want to talk to him about the book because the book is really terrific, even without these star celebs paying these ridiculous amounts of money to get their kids in. But it was that moment where we all just sat there and said, wait, what were people doing?
Yeah.
Like, you thought you were just taking your kid to get a special tutor, or you had a college counselor. There were people actually spending $500,000 on getting their child into USC.
On a fake lacrosse team. And did you see the other day that Donald Trump, his niece, said that he paid somebody to take his SAT?
And I'm like,
Trump's Varsity Blues. Yeah.
When I was back in school, did anybody pay to get in? I mean, seriously, I'm trying to think, were we ever even really thinking about that? I don't know. I don't think so. I remember, it was still stressful, and it wasn't the same thing even about how many AP tests you took. It wasn't the same, but there were all these moments where, were you taking enough? Were you doing enough even then? And I'm talking a while back.
No, I know. I remember, I think I took 2 AP classes in high school. No, I think just one. I think US history. I never took AP English. Yeah. And
look what happened. And look what happened to you. In spite of this, I remember when I got in, I was waitlisted at Princeton. I got into Fordham, which is where I eventually went. And I remember there was a summer and they said, well, we're going to see, they just started accepting women. We're not sure what we're going to do. And I said to my mother one day, that's it. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not going to Princeton. If they ask me to speak ever, I'm never going to speak there. So I've spoken at Yale. I've spoken at many other places. But I said, I'm not going to be speaking at Princeton ever. It'll be there later on in life. It'll be their issue,
That's right.
But it's funny, even then it was, and then it was just the Ivies. There weren't even just prestige schools. There were really just the Ivies and then everything else. And now it's become a first-tier school and a second-tier school.
Yes.
And now we're tiering all over the place of what's going on. And actually, I'm looking at full of who's going to be open. I saw yesterday, MIT has decided just the seniors are going back, just the seniors, and everybody else can't come back. So by the time you get finished, it's what school is doing what right now, because it's just going to be completely up in the air.
Yeah, and this is a whole other subject, that I'm glad I didn't write a novel about this.
Exactly. Something that you didn't want to have to deal with, Yeah, and I'm just sitting there, I hadn't thought about it though, but it's also from the point of view of the teachers, for young children going to school and for college and for high school. A lot of it is the teachers are worried about becoming ill. And I found that was really interesting because I was always thinking about the children, but it was like, no, they're going to go party on the quad and then they're going to come inside and infect us. And I was like, there are many different perspectives that you see everything through, just like you're seeing them here in the book, because you're seeing it from the children, the parent, and also the school, because you've got the school of what the school wants to be. And they're trying to find the right kids to be in their school. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what the parents or the children are. They're looking for a kind of census that they're going to be able to work with going forward as well. And that was an interesting perspective from the principal. It's something different.
Yeah, and I in some ways the school is a character almost in the novel. I don't quite write the school that way, but you do get the sense of this kind of brooding school just waiting for people, like an octopus, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's not open, so you can't go see where your chair is going to be
Right,
or whatever, but
right,
you have to have one of those chairs. And I
right.
thought that was, I have to have, we don't know if this school is going to be everything it's touted to be either, but we have to get our child in because it is the thing to do. And I
Yeah.
thought that was, it's a perception and reality kind of a moment, you
Yeah, it's
know?
like a slice of exotic fish, I think, something like that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. My book group discussed the gifted school last year, and it was really funny because they were reading and they go, "Oh, there's nothing like that in our town," which I'm sitting there and I'm like, "Really?" And I said, "Do you remember like soccer? Like, do you remember all these?" And then we started getting into all the nuances of not just it being about school. And then we talked about, I mean, trying to get your child into the accelerated class that they didn't test well into. And by
Yeah,
the time we all sat down, I think we all sat back in our chairs and went guilty as charged, because I think that if on every single level, when you brought something else, we all had done it. But we're
right.
going, oh no, we're nothing like the parents in this book. And I'm like, wait a second, let's take a little look back. I think we are much
Right.
more like this than we actually believe, you know? So
Yeah, I
yeah.
think there's a lot of denial in, the way people read it.
Yeah, there's like, oh, wait a second. Oh, God, that really might be me, you know? I also feel there's so much pressure on kids today. And it's one of the things that I wrote about in my Bets on copy for the book, because I felt like what we've been pushing kids to do so much these last years. I often say that I wish they read 1,000 books before they got into college. If it was something like that, and if all these other different measures weren't being
Mhm.
used. But I also am thinking about these last few months when there's been a lot less racing around. There've been a lot more family dinners. There's
Mhm.
been a lot more conversation in the
Yes,
family. There've probably been a lot more slam doors as well. Let's get
yes.
real. But there's been a lot that the whole tone has just shifted back. It's always about like, what are we doing as a family now? What are we thinking about? And it's just
Mhm.
changed so dramatically. And I'm trying to figure out what the emphasis of that is going to be later on. And if these same people were sort of like locked down at the same time, like what would have happened to all of them? Like if they weren't seeing each other and it
Yeah,
was still trying to get into that school,
yeah,
because
that's a great.
we're in this really interesting moment right now where I
Well,
think,
and
go
one
ahead.
of the families, the family that Ati Yupanqui belongs to, and he is a Peruvian migrant kid who he speaks 3 languages, and he's kind of a genius at origami, and so the school has its eyes on him, and you see his story through the lens of his grandmother, and you realize that like that, if the lockdown were happening during the novel, they would be much more endangered, right? They would be
Mhm.
more at more of a disadvantage. They might be deemed essential workers. They couldn't get by on quarantine without being forced to go to work. So that is, that I think about that a lot. And the 4 core families in the novel are, they're living a life of privilege. It might have been easy to live a lockdown life. For so many people, it's not. And I those kind of inequities. One of the eerie things about quarantine, I think it's kind of shielded many of us from seeing those inequities, even the way that we do in everyday life.
Mhm.
Um, and so that, we've been quarantining ourselves from our view of culture in a way. And
Mhm.
that's good.
Agreed.
It's going to be really interesting to see what fiction looks like in the wake of this. I've talked about it a lot with other writers. And is this something that you're now incorporating into your novel? How can you write a realist novel set in the present that doesn't deal with the biggest thing that's happened to the United States in the last 50 years?
Mhm. Mhm.
How can you avoid it? It's bigger than 9/11.
Mhm.
Um, so it'll just be really interesting to see what fiction looks like in a couple years.
It will be because there's been just an impact on every single level. Every
Yeah,
single thing you do all day long, you're rethinking, thinking about how to do. I mean, even when I think about, I did want to interview you last year, but you didn't come through New York. But now you're still not in New York, and I get to
right.
talk to you.
Yeah,
And it's a much easier opportunity than it was just a year ago
yeah.
for wanting to have that same kind of a conversation.
Well,
So much has been facilitated as a
yeah.
result as well.
Yeah, and the events that I've done virtually, the
Mhm.
attendance is amazing. Like, you go to a bookstore and do a reading at a bookstore, not in a big city, and you feel like if 15 or 20 people come, I mean, I'm not a huge bestseller or anything,
Mhm.
but if 15 or 20 people come to your event, you're like, that was amazing. What a great crowd. Now I'm getting like 80 or 100 people
Mhm.
coming to the Zooms, and it's
Mhm.
fantastic. So I do think publicists are watching this and they're thinking, what's the better bang for the buck? And I
Mhm.
do think we'll see a lot more virtual things.
I
Um,
I feel the same way too. I do a lot of events with libraries where I'll just talk about a group of books, and
Yeah.
I'll talk about these are books that are exciting me, whatever. And I notice that there's so many people, and it's also nice that when it's over, you just have to walk to the kitchen. You don't have to run for a plane. You don't have to
Mhm.
do any of these things that, people think travel is like so much fun, but trying to make the plane when you're sitting in traffic in Chicago
Yeah.
is not a great experience. Knowing
Right.
you
Right.
have to get someplace, jet lag, time zones, all this kind of stuff. It's wonderful to go see people, but by the same people to be able to reach people and really be able to talk in depth about a book. Is sometimes at a bookstore, the timing is limited, and then you're going to sign, and who doesn't need a book because they already got the book, so they're
Right.
not going to come talk to you. This is just a whole different kind of
It
experience.
really is. Yeah.
So you're a professor of English at the University of Virginia, and you've been there since 2005, and you're teaching modern critical thought and medieval literature. What's changed? What has changed for the kids that you've seen, like coming through? Is it the same student in 2005, or do you find that, for all this pressure we're putting on kids today, have they changed? Because, it's like college is nirvana, college is your goal. And when
Mhm.
they get there, how are they feeling?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest difference, and I don't know, I'm probably going to have my dates wrong here. The biggest difference in students that I see has to do with the smartphone. And I'm
Mm,
not going on a big rant against
mhm,
technology,
mhm,
but it's more about the quality and depth of attention
mhm,
to the works in front of us. And so I think the students today that I teach, they're much more canny readers of short forms like poetry. You'll often get especially lyric poetry. I think there might be a kind of sharpness to that I didn't see 20 years ago, but much less attentive readers of novels. And it's really hard to teach a novel in
mhm.
class anymore, and to assume that people have actually read it. For that matter, to assume that I've read it as carefully as I should have, because I think all of our attention, so it's a cliche to say that attention spans are getting shorter, but in the classroom, you really see it on the level of, I think I say the same for me as I say for my students now. I think that the work of assimilation is
Mhm.
much more difficult than it was 15 years ago. It's something that we don't practice anymore, and or practice not as much as we should. To be able to take a large amount of information and synthesize it and distill it and be able to talk about it in large sweeping terms, that seems harder now for longer works. That's
Mhm.
the main, but in terms of the quality of mind, I don't think that's diminished at all.
No, but I see what you're saying, because a lot of times I read my best, even when reading a novel, when
Mhm.
I'm out on the patio and my
Mhm.
phone is in the house.
Yeah,
Because I'm not, because I might be sitting out there and I might see chipmunk on ground, chipmunk going to eat the dahlias, blah, blah, blah. And you start this whole train
yeah,
of thought. Instead of just thinking what I should make for dinner, it's where's that pasta recipe? What ingredients do we need? And you're
exactly.
immediately at this like lookup kind of a thing. Whereas if my phone's in the house, I seem perfectly content to just sit and read the book. I
Right.
seem perfectly fine to be doing this. But I did read YA reading was down during the pandemic, like the first couple of weeks. And I don't know where it is now, but it
Interesting.
was down. But you think about it, there are a couple of reasons that I was seeing for that is, number one, what do teens like to do is socialize. So what was taken away was school, where school is socialization. So if you were going to go home and read and be by yourself, now you constantly want to know what everyone's doing. And even if it's in dribs and drabs, because you're not with everyone. So I
Yes.
saw that as one reason. The other thing I saw was that 20 somethings who were also a big readers of YA were a lot of the people who were either furloughed because they were, young and, or, laid off, or they were the ones who were trying to decide whether they're going to home and live with their parents. Like maybe
Yes.
they're not packing your books is not your first thing. It's going to be your
Oh, yeah.
clothes and, how you're going to deal with everything else. And you could see why this definitely would slip. And then we saw the older population who's on a fixed income, nothing changed, who's
Mhm.
now locked down, more time on their hands. If anything, the transition was from reading print to ebooks or starting to read everything that were on the shelves in their homes.
Right.
So with very interesting things that happened even during this set period of time.
Yeah.
And young moms had zero time to read. My young mother's book club, no time to read,
Yeah.
because they were dealing with homeschooling and then working into the evening. So
Right.
it's kind of interesting to see what's been happening with publishing, just based on what's happening now is
Yeah.
the different influences, what's going on. But the people in the classroom, I've always wondered what would happen. And I could see the smartphone being a totally different, I'm trying to remember when it really started to be a thing. Was
Yeah,
it
I don't have the dates right.
2007 or 8? I'm
Something like
trying to,
that. Yeah.
I mean, I had the first cell phone that was a suitcase. I used to carry it like I was Get Smart, like the guy in Get Smart. Yeah, I had one of those too,
Yeah.
because I felt like I needed to be in constant contact.
Yeah.
No idea why, you know?
Yeah.
There've been a lot of comparisons to this book and Big Little Lies. And I think it kind of works because you've got those set families that are in this small town. They're all inside of each other's lives in different ways. There are all kinds of different relationships. Have you heard that from readers besides what we just hear in the media? When you're talking to people, are they seeing the same kind of parallels between the two books?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of reviews have mentioned that. I think the blurb on the cover of the hardcover, it was from Meg Wolitzer, but her full blurb was like Big Little Lies with standardized testing or something like that. And yeah, it's a great, very flattering comparison. Obviously some differences, of course. We in the industry, we talk about what's your comp, right? What's the comparable titles? And to have one like Big Little Lies, hey, who can sneeze at that, right? That's
it's not a bad one at all, but it really rings true. Sometimes those comparisons come up. Like everything was for Girl on a Train for years. And a lot of things have been to Big Little Lies. This really works because the characters are so fully developed, and I could hear the soundtrack. I mean, really, I can hear a soundtrack playing. It's not a problem at all. It's not a problem at all. Now, I do want to talk to you about it because the covers are so different. I mean, I've got both covers. What was the thought behind this cover, and what was the thought behind this cover?
Sure. Yeah. Well, if you're a writer at a commercial publisher, you get some say in your cover, but you don't get a lot of say. So, you're presented with something, and usually your editor will say, "We love this. This is what we're doing." And I was when the initial one was presented to us, it was it was something that I thought instantly when I saw that. It's kind of perfect because you're looking down on a town that it looks like you're in Colorado. You see a hint of mountains. I love the script, right? The typeface that they're using for it, which is like whiteboard. Kind of somebody writing, like you could see a parent writing on a whiteboard on the fridge, the gifted school reminder, right? And I think also that cover, their publicists and editors and designers, they're all thinking also about where your book is going to get reviewed. And I think that cover was trying to say, yes, it's a commercial novel. It's also a literary novel. It has those elements. And then when they were doing the paperback design, they were thinking about airports and the beach, the summer that summer after it comes out. And they were thinking about, Target and drugstores and so on. So they wanted that. I think it's a trade paperback, not a mass market paperback. But they wanted it to, have that kind of ambience that, something very brightly colored that you might grab on your way through the airport. Not that anybody's going to the airport anymore, but you know what I mean. So it's also got a little bit of a chick lit feel to it, I think, in the way that the hardcover didn't. And I think that's all to the good. And so, I think those were the considerations. Yeah,
this one had like a gravitas to it for getting great reviews. And this one's got, pick me up, you need to read me right this minute, and it's like, this is this year, this is what you've got to do. And you've also got the moms with the phones in their hand, definitely preoccupied with their lives. And it was kind of funny with what we were talking about with smartphones.
It's funny that, I actually have not seen the paperback yet because there's been shipping problems and I haven't gotten my copy. So flip through it for a minute. Let me see, how thick is it? How many pages does it have?
Let me see. I'm going to have to put my glasses on.
I haven't seen it.
It's 550.
Oh, wow. So it's longer than the
550. Yes. And this was, hold on one second. Let me check.
430 something. Yeah.
Yeah. It was 452. Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's a meaty book, and it even was last year, and it was not your typical light summer read, but I flew through it. I remember exactly where I was sitting when I read it, and I just absolutely loved it. And I remember talking about it. As soon as I finished reading it, I came in and told readers it's going to be a Bets On selection. This is why the book. And I wrote, sometimes I write a quick Bets On because it doesn't need, like, especially if it's a thriller. I don't want to give like that much away. And this is a thriller in some ways, but it's more the straight literary fiction. But by the same token, I came in and I've just read like paragraphs and paragraphs about this book. So it obviously inspired me so much when I came in that I was like, wait a second, I really want to talk about this. And I was immediately saying to people, this is the book you want to read. And it was something I was putting into people's hands, because I said, when you see it, it's a microcosm of Americana, but it's also hitting on a bigger Americana and what's going on right now, because you could take this to just about any neighborhood and whatever and put it on a different level of what people are trying to do.
Yeah.
And even you've got, there was a show on, I think it was called Avenues, a documentary about this very prestigious school that was in New York City. And it was down, I want to say in the 20s, I might be wrong on that. And Avenues, were they going to take in children from that neighborhood, which were, there were also some children on the poverty line, and trying to get them in. And it was a fascinating documentary, but I have to say it was even better after reading this book and thinking about these people.
Those issues, yeah.
And thinking about the issues that are involved and seeing what's exploded with social issues over the past year. And then thinking about it in reference to the book, because you do have a child who's trying to get in and isn't on the cusp of all the right ticked boxes of what the families think should be for a gifted child.
Right.
So it's, you know, completely there. So last year there was an option on the book for NBC Universal. Has there been any movement on that, or because pandemic, we're not doing anything?
No, it's funny you should say. There has been quite a lot of movement, and I can't really say anything yet, but it's, you know, a lot of books get optioned.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wasn't expecting much, but you know, fingers crossed, I don't want to jinx anything, but you know, there's now a showrunner and writer assigned to it, and we'll see. I'll probably know more in a couple of months.
Well, you've ticked a lot of the right boxes on the book. So let's put it that way. There's a lot of good plot to go with.
Yeah.
If somebody sit there and say, boy, this man was definitely looking at the, you know, the big picture of what was going to happen next, you should just say, yes, that's what I was doing.
I just somehow knew. Yeah.
I somehow knew.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, you previously wrote 2 historical nonfiction books. Is there anything else brewing? Is there anything else that you're working on at this point?
Yeah, actually the novels, they were historical novels, actually.
Okay.
The first 2.
I'm sorry,
works of fiction, and I also have written a number of academic nonfiction books for university presses. So that's, you know, in my day job. The next novel will be called The Displacements, and it's a novel about it's also about mostly about one family from Miami that is displaced in the wake of the world's first Category 6 hurricane that destroys the city, and so it's about climate displacement, and but also about privilege and inequality, and the way the world is changing.
And what time frame? When was that? When did that incident actually happen? When was it?
Oh, it's set in the near future.
Oh, the near future. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not an apocalyptic novel.
No.
It's very much a present day novel, but in the very near present.
I don't know. You've been kind of like clairvoyant before. I don't know.
We'll see. I don't want to be clairvoyant about this one, but I mean, we are facing this. So this is an attempt to kind of think about it in a very realist way, not by using post-apocalyptic elements, but by thinking about what the country and the world are facing in the next, 5 to 10 years.
Well, a couple of years ago, I was down at the Miami Book Fair in Miami, and
I've been down.
I was staying down in the Brickell area, and they said, "Oh yeah, this area was all built up, blah blah blah." And then during the next storm, it flooded really heavily, like the same problems we had in Houston, because it wasn't meant to be built up like that. It wasn't, and it's just when you've been to those places and then you see what happens and what the possibilities are, it makes it even all more real of like, wait a second, this wasn't supposed to be there. We weren't supposed to have built out this far. We weren't supposed to have done, and even in the mid 80s, I remember the advertising director, I worked at Mademoiselle Magazine, our advertising director of the agency we worked with, his home was off the coast of the Hamptons, and it was now underwater. It was now uninhabitable. And that, we're really talking like 30 years ago, that was
multiply that by 100,000.
Exactly.
And that's what. Yeah.
And and when you heard that that happened to him, you just thought, oh, that was no big deal. Da, da, da. And now I'm thinking about that was 30 years ago. What's happened since,
Oh, yeah.
So, well, look, it's been a pleasure. I'm glad we got to do this. I'm glad we finally got to talk to you about the book. And I'm looking forward to all of our readers picking up a copy of The Gift of School. You will not be disappointed. Trust me. It's absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for joining me. And to our readers, look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.